You're listening to a bonus episode of The Dairy Edge featuring Teagasc's weekly Let's Talk Dairy webinar series, which is also available as a podcast.
Good morning, everybody, and you're very welcome to our Let's Talk Dairy webinar for today. Okay, we're joined here by Joe Patton from the Dairy KT team. A few weeks ago, Joe, on the Let's Talk Dairy webinar, we had Mike Egan on. And Mike has been talking about maybe some revisions in the whole dry matter allowances for dairy cows. So, look, I want to get your thoughts on what Mike has been telling us about that. So where do we start at all?
Yeah, it's a good one. Funny, you can come at this in two ways. Like, Mike has been measuring the intake. I know we had predicted intakes previously based off the energy and protein requirements for the animal.
Yep.
But they've measured the intakes, and you're really talking about sort of 1.5 kilos more than what we would have been previously talking. But something I've been looking at lately too is going back and doing some there's sort of revisions on the system as well, on the French system, around the requirements for maintenance and milk. And if you look at the revised requirements as well, they end up coming up with an assumption of about 1.5 kilos extra intake required. And a lot of that is for maintenance, actually. So the maintenance cost of cows might, So rather, we used to be saying 5.5 UFLs for maintenance. It's more like maybe 6.5 now on a grazing, and more so, there's been good revisions made about the cost of maintenance on grazing systems. All that walking and those tougher nights and all that kind of stuff. It does add maybe UFL extra in the requirement. So, Mike measured it, and if you work it out with a on paper, or you work it out in the field, it kind of comes out to sort of that 1.5 kilos extra intake. And look at, I'd say, and Joseph Dunphy probably would say similar, that when you look at the way grass budgets went over the last few years, people always ran slightly ahead, maybe, in some cases. And if ground conditions are good, you could see the cows were eating more than what was on paper. And maybe what that was leading to was a tight corner maybe in the end of March, early April, because the cows were going a little bit faster than maybe what they were predicted to do. So that revision is probably borne out a little bit in terms of what happens on the ground as well. I don't know, Joe, would you agree with that? But I think maybe cows were eating a bit more than what we were saying, and still achieving the residuals as well. So, it's probably a tweak, but it's an important one.
With my own group, Joe, I was always saying, they always talk about having plenty of grass in the spring, but there's no grass at the end of March. I always say, how does that happen? So obviously this is feeding into that.
Well, there's two things there. Like, obviously stocking rates have gone up on farms. So if you go back years ago, we used to be trying to get the spring rotation planner really was an exercise in trying to get people to go out early. Now, I suppose, as Joe Dunphy's talking about and Grass 10 are talking about there, it's the need for the budget to make sure that you don't go too far ahead, because people know the benefits of getting out early. It's a matter of not going too far. So maybe the bad week has kind of put the brakes on at a time when the brakes probably had to go on anyway on a lot of farms.
With all the giving out we've got from the two Johns and Joe, so over the last couple of weeks about people grazing too fast, here we are now coming up to the end of March, and we'll just be about on target with the way the weather turns on us.
Well, that's what my neighbour says. He says it'll all work out. What are you worried about? Sure, it'll all. But look, it's the benefits of the early grazing was clear for all to see in February. Like, people had a great time, and I think that should be remembered. We always remember the bad spring.
Yeah,
but we should remember the good springs too, and what we learned in them.
We're just going to anchor here now for a second, Joe. So we've someone here, the herd of cows they have is heading towards a peak of say 31 or 32 litres.
Yeah.
Calved, their mean calving date somewhere in the 10th and 15th. What would be the typical or kind of recommended daily allowance intake, and then maybe they're getting 4 or 5 kilos a meal? It says, what would the daily intake allowance be for those sort of herds at the moment?
At the moment, is it? Considering there's grass. Yeah. Right. Look, in that situation, they're kind of well settled, maybe slightly earlier calved.
Yeah.
You're going to be in that ballpark of sort of the 5-6 kilo mark, George, in terms of concentrate. And you're really if it's grass by day, or maybe 2 bouts of grass. Like, if it's grass by day, what are you getting in? You're getting in 6 kilos of, maybe 7 kilos of grass. And maybe 5 to 6 kilos of concentrate. That's bringing it to 12. They're going to be needing 5-6 kilos of good quality silage.
That's roughly a round bale for quality round bale for the cows.
That's kind of it. And look at with grazing management, with good silage and good grazing management, obviously you want the silage gone or close to gone, and by the early part of by early morning, that they're going out with a bit of an edge on them. But maybe the second bout, if possible, might be as big a thing as anything, depending on the budget, obviously, because some people are behind. But if you're looking at that sort of getting up to sort of the 17 kilos, pushing towards 18 and a little more with it over the next couple of weeks as cows move through lactation, that's probably where you'd need to be. So I'm getting a few queries lately is kind of, when people are in full time or, in at night, or maybe only getting a few kilos, are we going up to 7 and 8 kilos of concentrate? To me, it's kind of different. If you're saying for somebody that's going to be freshly calved in November and they're going to be going into 100 days where they're guaranteed to be indoors, right? Yeah. You'll settle them in on 7 or 8 kilos of concentrate and build them up to that. The issue with the situation at the moment is, even though the cows are milking well, going up to 7 or 8 kilos in the short term and then taking it all back out again could cause more problems than it'll fix. So I would be thinking more getting them at that sort of 5-6 kilo rate when they're inside, and back down to the 3-4s quickly when they're sort of settled into 2 grazing bouts a day. So even though on paper you'd be saying, oh geez, these cows are going to be short, I'd suffer it for a week rather than risk the digestive problems of pushing up to very high concentrate levels if you're only going to be in for the short term. And as Joe Dunphy has promised us there, things are going to get better over the next week. So what's the point in building up to 8 kilos to come back down again? You're going to have digestive problems if you keep moving around too much.
Okay. I was the other thing it emphasises, Joe, is the importance of having a kind of a bank of good quality silage to feed cows.
100%, George. I think the whole thing, it's very simple. If there's a block of 74, 75 DMD silage in the yard, you've got good opening covers, you're only ever really going to be fluctuating between sort of 3 to 6 kilos of concentrate in the spring. You don't really have a problem. The cows are happy enough and they'll eat the silage and graze out the grass properly. So, I was talking to Martina yesterday. Actually, she was talking to a group in the south, and that came up. What do we do? We have bad silage and the cows are stuck inside. What do we do? And she said to them, it's too late to do anything about it. You need to think about what silage you're going to make for next year, in a way, because you're stuck with what you have. So if you're sick of bad silage this year, the most important response to that is make some better stuff. Exactly.
Joseph, tell us about the ration spec then that you're talking about for those 3 to 6 kilos a meal.
Yeah, look, So look, we've spoken about this a little bit over the past couple of years, and I think to just break it down and keep it quite simple, I suppose, look, the way we would look at that is for any of the specs, George, think of it this way. What we're really looking at is it's a glorified 3-way mix, really. Maybe not that glorified, but what it is a cereal, a pulp, and a protein source, right? So your cereals is obviously going to be barley or maize, beet pulp or soya hulls, and then distillers maybe as the protein source. So that's kind of 30%, 30%, 30%, right? And then the final 10% is made up of your minerals. So that's going to be obviously CalMag, salt, some calcium, some phosphorus, some molasses as well, obviously, and a bit of oil, right? So that 10% is made up of all those other bits plus your trace elements. But the 30, 30, 30 is your sort of cereal pulp and your protein source. Now, if you fed it as barley, let's say if it was barley, beet pulp and hulls, for example, barley, beet pulp and distillers, that's going to come out at 14%, right? To make that into a 16% ration, you basically take out 10 of the distillers and put in 10 of soya. So the only difference between a 14 and a 16 should be whether there's 10% soya in there or not, if that makes sense. So it's relatively straightforward. And look at, if you're on a very dry track and you know that it's pretty much grassed by full time every year and things are very simple, you might be starting out the year with a 14% ration. If you're in a situation like that's your sort of Curtains farm, if you want to say it like that. The Ballyhays farm or maybe Solihull as an alternative might be where you're going to be in at night or whatever over a few nights in the spring. You probably would kick for touch a little bit and go with a 16% for the first load, if you like. So really, when you think about it, the difference in a 14% and a 16% in that context is whether you've got 10% soya included or not, and everything else stays relatively similar.
And you go with the 16 if you're indoors by night, sort of thing.
Kind of would, yeah. And the question comes up then, what happens if I have a 14 in the bin and I have to go in at night?
Yeah.
in first principles would say you should add a bit of protein, which the easiest way to do that is add a bit of soya on the silage. But again, I'm very conscious of having the idea of people going around the yard with buckets and all this kind of stuff. Will it be worth it for them?
Yeah.
It's debatable. I think if you could get grass in by day, it takes a lot of that problem out of it, to be honest. Yeah. So look, that's it. They will be deficient in protein if they're on silage on 14%. They'll be okay over the short term if they're on a 16%. So I suppose, look, a lot of these things is, you'd say there's the diet for today and it looks deficient in protein, but will they be back out tomorrow? Are you going to do oftentimes, a lad who said it to me lately, he says, I was going to order the soya. He says, by the time the soya was ordered, the cows are back out again. And by the time it was delivered, the cows are back out. And now I had to feed the soya to use it up. So are you getting a good response out of that? Probably not. So
like the usual thing, like for a day or two, in theory you should, but in practice, do you really want to bother?
That's it. And I think what we should be focusing on really is that if there's a bit of messing going on at the minute and things are hard on stock, an extra kilo of concentrate or so while they're inside, and make sure that they're well fed and full to avoid. I think avoiding health problems is a bigger issue than worrying about a pint or two in protein, to be honest.
Question coming in there, Joe. Any need for an 18% ration if you're only grazing for a few hours?
No.
On a heavy
heavy farm. No. Look, I don't think so. I think the way I look at it is, if guaranteed, as I said, real dry farm, you probably can go with 14 the whole time, and you're probably dropping that back to 12 actually in the summer. Yeah, if you're on a spring calving system where you're going to be on wet ground or heavy land, you sort of, your typical sort of heavy type ground, you're sort of saying 16 for the first load maybe, and then back to 14, and the only difference is the change in soya. Where would you use an 18? You would really only be using an 18 if you're I think you're really only using it if you're calving in the autumn and you're heading into the winter and they're going to be inside on silage for over 100 days or 120 days. So to me, the 18% ration in a spring calving context is a thing of the past, to be honest.
Okay. Joe, just move on then a little bit. And look, we've breeding week going on this week, and yourself, Stuart, and the whole office are doing bits and pieces over the week. There's a lot going on. But I wanted to tell us a bit about kind of steaming up now cows for breeding in the next month or so. These spring calving cows. What are the key criteria there for that? What are your key guidelines?
The key guidelines is, a couple of things there. Really, when we talk about nutrition and fertility, George, what are we really saying? Yeah. We're talking about energy status, which is really body condition score, and mineral status as well. Yeah. Okay, we'll take the body condition one first. We've tried and failed we've actually given up doing these trials, because we know if you go back to the mid 2000s and into the sort of from about the year 2000 to about 2015, we did a pilot trials that said, here's 2 genotypes of cows or 2 breed types, and either 2, 4 or 6 kilos of meal over the breeding season, and see, does the feeding 6 kilos of meal make the cows go and calve? How many times did we do that trial? 20. There was hundreds of cows done on that trial, right? Feed them more, see will it go and calf. And the outcome of that has been, over years, there was no difference in conception rate and no difference in empty rate, right?
But Joe, there was a difference. And the difference that the cows fed the 2 kilos were managed really, really well.
True. Well, we'll take that into,
That's what a lot of people forget when they talk about that.
That's true. But look at George, we've lots of people with cows managed poorly feeding 6 kilos and they're still not going to calf.
They won't go and calf,
no. Right. So the solution to bad management isn't more meal.
No, it's not.
Even though there's a sort of a bit of an industry built on the idea around that, it's not the case. We've tried it forever and we've given up doing that trial. And I was actually looking at figures from one of the Hillsborough trials, actually outside of the Teagasc stable, if you like, doing a similar trial a few years back where they fed, I think it was from a half a ton of concentrate up to maybe 1.8 ton of concentrate across the year. And there was no difference in conception rate or empty rate. I think that 20% empty across all the meal types, but the breed types, the difference was between 10% for high fertility genetics and 30% for low fertility genetics. So if you want to sort out a fertility problem in terms of conception rate, it's listen to what's been said in breeding week around the genetics. You know this, you've been right, you've done it for long enough. So to draw the attention out of it. So that is, and that's the reality. Look, if we thought that feeding 6 kilos of meal in the month of April and May would put the cows in calf. Why wouldn't we say it? It would make our lives easier.
So what do you feed, Joe?
High quality grass that Joe's talking about, and maybe you're probably talking about in that sort of 2 kilo feeding rate. With the part of the reason for that is to get the mineral profile right. Okay, so high quality pasture is pre-grazing yields of 1400. Fiber levels are probably sort of high 30s to maybe maximum about 40. If you've got lower fiber in the grass, you're going to get more grass into the cows, which is more energy into the cows is what we want. People tend to discount the energy in grass for some reason and focus that all the energy is coming from the meal. It's not really the case. So if we get the fiber down and manage the wedge, as Joe was showing a few minutes ago, you could get an extra 2 kilos of intake in the grass. I think where we run into problems is where maybe not so much in April, but certainly when you start to get into mid-May, into the second, third week of breeding, and grass quality goes down the tube really because it gets out of hand, our intakes will actually drop because of the fiber in the grass. So if you want to do your cows a favor, get on top of the grass quality during the breeding season. And that's the thing, right? The 2 kilos of meal then, I suppose, is going in. It does give a wee top up in terms of that top up on energy for sure.
Yeah.
Any more than that, we're starting to get substitution. We're starting to lose grass intake. So we're not really getting a major difference in energy intake. The more meal we feed, the less grass the cows will eat. Okay. So the 2 kilos is there sort of to make sure you get in your make sure to get in your minerals and a wee kick extra in energy. We talk about minerals now in a second. I should just finish off that really it's body condition, George, isn't it? Like if the cows are in good nick, they're well fed, you have that sort of covered, right? So
and in that wet week or those few very tight days, maybe having enough grass come along, how would you feed then? What do you do?
You're probably saying your 2 kilos. If you're really bad and conditions are poor, you might stretch that up to sort of 3 to 4 kilos if things are very bad. But the main thing is then does that come back out again?
Yeah,
and it should come back out fairly quickly.
Yeah, because
if you leave it in, you really are just wasting grass, right?
And what would your grass allowance be, Joe, for a herd peaking around say 32 litres?
At 32 litres,
maybe 20, would it?
It's going to be with the meal and grass included. Those cows will be probably on an allowance of 18, and they'll eat the meal along with it. They'll be eating 19 to 20 kilos.
I'd say we're giving them.
They will.
Give them out to 20.
You will. But look, you're going to run that on the basis of when you get into that period, it's 24-hour allocations, managing it through the residuals. You know, basically, if you have to look at the residuals and get those right for sure, but you can get them right and overdo it as well. Like Michael O'Donovan's work from a few years ago was showing grazing to 3.5 in the summer was hitting on solids and hitting on body condition, whereas maybe grazing above 4 but not over 4.5 was getting you to a good balance between intake and grass quality. So there's a balance there too. Like we can graze it down very tight every time, but it can pinch the cows as well. And we've seen that on farms too, like, haven't we? We've seen it that where people have adjusted a little bit and give the cows an extra wee bit, they've eaten that and the residuals are still good, and they're getting extra output as a result, and maybe cows are a little bit healthier as well. So that's in it too, you know.
It's kind of it's a fine line. I want to move on to the minerals, Joe, but before you go on to the minerals, there's a question in there. If you have grass, I presume the intent of your grass, would you not just be better to feed the minerals for the breeding season?
Yeah,
say through a system or something like that.
If possible, if you have plenty of grass, that's possible, right? But I suppose, look, I'm just thinking here for a lot of people, and we want to squeeze that down into the smallest amount of concentrate possible. I suppose if you have the system set up and you can feed the minerals through water, etc., then that's fair enough. But do your sums on that too. It becomes relatively it's marginal enough at times, I would say. And like the thing about it is most people are going to have the infrastructure there to feed the concentrate anyway. So if you can get them off meal, that's fair enough. I think it becomes a marginal enough call, but I think the main issue for the industry is not the kilo that's going in to carry minerals. The main issue is probably the fact that people are feeding 4 and 5 to try and cover. And I've been on a great few farms over the last couple of years that have, you know, mineral delivery systems in place, and they're still feeding 5 kilos of meal.
Absolutely.
How many of them do you see around the place?
Plenty of them. Did you want to talk about minerals a minute, Joe?
Yeah, just on the minerals thing, and it's a good point. Like, I mean, if you can get the minerals in, by all means do. But it's either way. We should make this point as well, that there's no point in adding in two sources of minerals. It should be, it's one or the other. Like, you pick your choice and off you go, because sometimes you've got situations where there's more than one source of minerals going in, which is expensive, and it's not very productive to do that. But just a quick point on it, I suppose, George, is that when we talk about minerals, we have to separate out the sort of macro minerals, or the major minerals, from the trace minerals, right? So calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus obviously would be the major minerals. Sodium as well, obviously, that's your salt, versus your things like copper and selenium and iodine. Okay, the reason you want to make a distinction between the two of them is that trace minerals are needed in very, very small quantities. You can bolus them if you want, or you can add them in ways like that. Whereas the macro minerals need to go in pretty much every day, and they need to go in big chunky bits. They're going in grams per day. You're talking spoonfuls of the stuff. And I've seen it on a few farms over the last few years where maybe there's a problem with phosphorus, for example.
Yeah. And
lads are saying, I have a mineral problem, and I'm bolusing the cows, but I have a mineral problem. Why have I still got a mineral problem? Phosphorus has to be fixed through the feed or through the water, not through a bolus, because your cow needs about 65 grams of phosphorus a day. If the grass is tight for phosphorus, that might be as low as 45. You need to add in 20 grams of extra phosphorus a day, which if you're putting it through the meal is about 6-7 grams per day of extra phosphorus through the meal, right? So the advice would be there, and I've spoken to Seamus in the vet labs in Athlone of this over a few years, and Marissa in Kilkenny as well. The idea would be, just test the cows in mid-April if you think you have a mineral problem. If it shows up a phosphorus problem on the minerals, fix the phosphorus problem. If it shows up a copper problem, fix the copper problem. But we need to move away from the idea that minerals are minerals. It's be more specific than that. That's the main point.
Well, the other one, Joe, that's tended to be prevalent or deficient everywhere is iodine.
Yeah. Iodine is,
magnesium is a tricky enough one, isn't it? Because it'll be gone quick enough.
It'll be gone quick enough. But again, with iodine, it's a good question, George, that we just need to be a bit careful with iodine, that we can be a bit too liberal with it. We can be bolusing and adding it to water and putting it. And I can see the logic. If somebody's had a problem with iodine, they're not going to take any chances and they fire in a lot of iodine. But like sort of 13, I think the figures about 12, 13 milligrams or thereabouts would be the total amount of additional iodine fed, not 40 or 50. And what we want to do is be careful that we don't overdo it, because we'd have residue in milk then if we overdo it. So we don't want to so pick an option and go with it, rather than pick 3 options or 2 or 3 options for iodine. That's the way I would say. So let's say, for example, there's a major copper problem on the farmers, copper selenium problem, and you want to hit that quickly. You're probably saying a copper selenium bolus, not a bolus that has a pile of iodine in it as well. Yeah.
Question come in there. What about pasture dusting with CalMag, I presume?
With CalMag, look at another option, of course. I suppose we have the water option, the pasture dusting option, and the concentrate option as well. I think the main thing on that, I suppose it depends on where I suppose the higher the inclusion rate you can get in the concentrate, the more competitive that would be. Obviously, the pasture dusting can be beneficial, but it's another task. Possibly quite inefficient in ways, depending on how it's done. The water option is a good option too for mag. They will all work, I think, as long as you're hitting it's difficult because you talk to some people and say, I went to the pasture dust and it's a great job, and other people say, oh, I don't like it, I'd rather just give a kilo of concentrate. So as long as you're hitting the intake of CalMag, either way, it's, as I'm saying, either way, whichever one you choose, pick one and go with it. I wouldn't be against it at all, but the problem with pasture dusting is it's hitting probably mag only.
It's only mag,
you still have to maybe get in phosphorus, or you still may have to get in your trace elements as well. So there's more to minerals than just mag, I suppose.
Okay. Question come in there. What would you be looking to test for the cows for pre-breeding? Are there any specific tests to ask for?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think to me anyway, the big one to be looking at, if you take your blood test, I should say, if we're doing anything like this, you're probably looking at doing something that's probably 3 weeks ahead of 2 to 3 weeks, at least 3 weeks ahead of breeding. I would say taking the samples, having the samples back to allow you a couple of weeks to do something about a deficiency problem if it's there. Certainly phosphorus would be definitely one. You're probably looking for your copper and selenium levels, maybe iodine levels as well. But I think copper, selenium, iodine,
They'd be the big ones,
and
anyway,
phosphorus would be the big one. So your 3 trace elements, and then your one big one would be the phosphorus for sure.
I think the phosphorus is always turning up a bit like milk fever, isn't it?
How do you mean now?
As a symptom, in symptomatic, they're often confused.
Yeah, and look, we've seen it over the year in the milking cows. We've seen a bit of it in the last few seasons, maybe where cows are licking stones and this kind of stuff in the month of April. If you're seeing that, you'd be thinking, you'd have to at least be first thing you'd be thinking of is phosphorus, and you have to rule that out.
Yeah.
It does have a clinical behavioral thing very, very quickly. Generally speaking, George, what you'd see is if you have a problem with the major minerals like magnesium, phosphorus, or calcium, you're going to have a very immediate effect on the cow, and you'll also have a very immediate response to the treatment. Whereas something with like the likes of copper, it's a slow, gradual decline in performance, and maybe a slow and gradual improvement as well.
Yeah, the only one that's really quick is iodine supplementation. You get a rapid turnaround.
A rapid turnaround in it, yeah.
That's what is valuable. Joe, to be conscious of our time, but there's a question I have to ask you, and it comes up every year. My herd is averaging 30 kilos or 32 litres, whatever the figure is. But if a bundle of cows there's about 10 of them, and they're doing 50 litres or they're doing 45 litres. Do they need to be fed separately, or do they need extra feed?
They need to be fed differently, George. But they're doing that themselves.
They're looking after themselves.
To a large extent, yes. They are fed differently. They have different energy requirements. They have different intake requirements. But if it's a good cow doing 45 litres, she knows how to do that herself. Because funny to say, in a lot of herds, you have these cows that are sitting. You look at the milk record and you go, "Jeekers, there's quite a range here." And again, back to some nice data from Moorpark that Mike did a few years back. The range in intake, let's say if you have an average dry matter intake of 18 kilos of grass, for argument's sake, right? Yeah. The range in that will be sort of from 15 thereabouts in your heifers, maybe up to maybe 22, 23 kilos.
Yeah.
And I've seen it myself actually years ago doing stuff with cows, measuring intakes in the bins, and that was in an indoor context. Some of the bigger cows, bigger yielding cows, could be doing 27, 28 kilos of dry matter intake, even though the herd average could be 20. So they will take in that. There's a reason why they're milking. You have these cows that are doing, 3 kilos of milk solids and they go in calf. It doesn't come out of thin air. They're eating their own allocation and somebody else's as well. Yeah. So, but it does add a thing though that, and I mean, you can see it in herds that are maybe new herds or expanded herds. The intakes were lower because you had a higher proportion of heifers. Yeah. But as cows mature and as the herd matures, like if you only have 16, 17% heifers in the herd and you have a lot of older cows, their intake on average is going to be higher than a herd that has 40, 50% first calvers, And
the funny thing is, if they're well bred for both fertility and milk, you'll find that they're actually doing the milk without pulling off their back.
That's the thing.
The whole condition.
So I think in a sort of standard spring calving scenario where you don't have a big range in calving dates, for example, and it's relatively straightforward, we need to simplify the thing, and we sort of need to allow those cows to do their own thing a little bit. Now, I would say this too, that if you do feed them, you may get a milk yield response. It'll be an expensive thing to get because you'd have to have all the tech to do that, but it probably won't have any benefit to fertility.
Yeah, fair enough. Joe, listen, we're going to wrap it here, but before you go, breeding week has been going on. I was down in Kildalton yesterday with a great turnout, and a really good crowd. It was an excellent day, and the lads did a brilliant job down there. But what's coming up in the last day or two of the breeding week? Can you tell us?
You're probably in the spot there. No, I think the main thing really to think of this evening, I suppose, is the breeding webinar. It's a sort of a State of the Union thing. We've got Dunnaberry and from Moorpark Margaret Kelleher from ICBF, and Philip Donoghue, dairy farmer, is joining the panel as well. And that's really to look at, I suppose, take a bigger picture look at things, George. I mean, we've been around different parts of the country this week, answering all the detailed questions about what bulls will I use on my herd and all the rest of it. But we probably do need as well to take a look at where the overall picture is going now in terms of, where is genomics going, genotype in the national herd, for example, where the beef genetics will fit in, all the issues around that, and maybe, how more data-driven decisions. So like with Donna, Margaret and Philip, there'd be a nice balance there between the science of it and the practice of it as well. So that's the main event, I suppose, for this evening. So that should be interesting for farmers, for advisors and industry people as well, because, it's one thing about the breeding. By definition, breeding is a forward-looking science. It's always about the future. And I think the rate of change, it's really when we go back and look at how much things have changed, even in the last 10 years, the rate of change in the national herd has been phenomenal, driven on the science of EBI. We want to maybe get a look at, can we continue that progress and accelerate it maybe a little bit? All the questions around carbon and those issues as well, obviously, would be a big part of that too. So that webinar is on this evening. The website, the link is on the website. Sure, dial in if you're interested, I suppose. Yeah.
And I suppose just as a final plug, on the day after, that's on Friday the 24th.
Yeah.
It's actually a walk on Philip's farm. So Philip's
correct. Sorry, yes.
The genetics in Philip's herd is the equivalent of the Lions UCD herd, and it's the equivalent of the high genetic merit animals, and it's also similar to the Johnstown Castle herd.
Yeah.
So look, he's doing a phenomenal job down in outside Borris there, between Borris and Gores Bridge. It's well worth a visit, guys. If you anyone or ladies,
absolutely, yeah, I should have said that. So Philip's helping us out this evening, and then showing how it's done then tomorrow. So that's going to be a very interesting day too.
The bonus will be phenomenal for Philip. Listen, guys, and thank you very much. And Joseph, thanks very much for coming on here to talk to us this morning. Safe farming, everybody. We'll talk to you next week.
That's all for this week's bonus episode from the Let's Talk Dairy webinar series, and don't forget to look out for more bonus episodes each week. I'll be back with the usual Dairy Age podcast on Monday, so do listen in then. I'm Stuart Childs, and thanks for listening.